The rusty padlock on the old Hendricks barn hadn't been opened in 30 years, but Jake Morrison had no choice. With his family farm 3 weeks from foreclosure and his last $200 burning a hole in his pocket, this junkyard of a property was his only shot at salvation. The auction had been a joke. Nobody wanted land that came with decades of hoarded garbage. But Jake Morrison wasn't just any desperate farmer. 20 years ago, he'd been the military's top intelligence analyst, trained to spot patterns others missed, to find needles in haystacks. Those skills had been buried along with his classified past when he'd returned home to tend his dying father's land. As Jake cut through the padlock and stepped into the musty darkness, his trained eye immediately caught something the previous owner had missed. Hidden beneath layers of old furniture and moldering boxes was a metal case bearing a symbol that made his blood run cold, a symbol from his past, a symbol that could change everything or get him killed. What was a top-secret government case doing in a dead man's barn? Jake's hands trembled as he pushed aside a moth-eaten rocking chair and crouched beside the aluminum case. The stale air caught in his throat, thick with dust and the scent of decades-old decay. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the weathered boards, casting prison bar shadows across the cluttered floor. He hadn't seen that particular classification marking since his discharge from Fort Meade, a small eagle surrounded by 3 interlocking circles. Level 7 clearance, the kind of clearance that came with lifetime non-disclosure agreements and very unfriendly reminders about what happened to people who talked. The case was smaller than a briefcase, but heavier than it should have been, military-grade aluminum with reinforced corners. Jake's pulse quickened as muscle memory kicked in. He'd handled dozens of these during his service, but never outside a secure facility. Never in a barn that reeked of mouse droppings and forgotten dreams. Old Man Hendricks had been the town recluse for as long as Jake could remember, a shuffling figure who bought groceries with exact change and never made eye contact. The man had died 6 months ago with no relatives, leaving behind 40 acres of mediocre farmland and this barn that the county assessor had dismissed as full of worthless junk. Jake had bid on the property sight unseen, desperate for anything that might generate enough income to save his family's land. He ran his fingers along the case's edges, searching for the hidden release mechanism. There, a slight depression near the handle. He pressed it and heard the satisfying click of tumblers aligning. The case opened with a soft hiss, revealing foam padding cut to precise specifications. Inside lay a single manila folder, thick with documents, and beneath it, something that made Jake's breath catch. A photograph of his father, maybe 25 years old, wearing a suit Jake had never seen. Standing beside him was a younger version of Old Man Hendricks, clean-shaven and sharp-eyed, also in government attire. Both men wore visitor badges for a facility Jake recognized immediately, the same classified installation where he'd spent 3 years of his life. His father had never mentioned knowing Hendricks, had never mentioned working for the government at all. According to family history, Robert Morrison had been a farmer his entire life, just like his father before him. But here was proof that story was a lie. Jake's hands shook as he opened the folder. The documents were photocopies, but the government seals looked authentic. Personnel files, transfer orders, and at the bottom, a letter in his father's handwriting dated just 2 months before his death. Jake, the letter began, if you're reading this, then Tom kept his promise. I pray you never have to see these papers, but if our family farm is in danger, you need to know the truth about what we did, about what we found. The mining rights we discovered in 1987 weren't just valuable, they were dangerous. Dangerous enough that certain people would kill to keep them buried. Tom and I made a deal with the government. We kept quiet, they kept us safe, and the land stayed in our families. But deals like that don't last forever. The letter went on to describe mineral deposits beneath both the Morrison and Hendricks properties. Rare earth elements worth millions, but located near something the government desperately wanted to keep secret. An underground facility that had been decommissioned after a containment breach in 1986. Jake's mind raced. His father's medical bills had drained the farm's savings, but if these mining rights were real, if they were still valid, then bankruptcy was the least of his concerns. The same government that had trained him to find hidden truths had been hiding the biggest truth of all right under his feet. A car door slammed outside, followed by footsteps crunching across gravel. Jake quickly closed the folder and case, his old instincts screaming warnings. No one knew he was here. No one should be here. The footsteps stopped just outside the barn door. "Mr. Morrison," a woman's voice called, "we need to talk." The old farmhouse creaked like ship timbers in a storm as Jake pushed through the front door, paint chips falling like snow around his shoulders. The smell hit him immediately. Decades of neglect mixed with something else he couldn't identify. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through cracked windows, and he could hear mice scurrying somewhere in the walls. His phone buzzed. Another text from Sarah. "How bad is it? Please tell me there's running water." Jake looked around at the warped floorboards, the water-stained ceiling, and the ancient wallpaper peeling in long, sad strips. He typed back, "It has character." That's realtor speak for condemned. He almost smiled despite everything. Sarah had been his anchor through the worst of it. The business failing, the lawyers, the humiliating bankruptcy proceedings. She deserved better than this disaster, but she'd stuck with him anyway. Now he had to figure out how to make this work. The house tour took 15 minutes. Every room told the same story of abandonment, broken fixtures, crumbling plaster, and that persistent, musty smell. The kitchen faucet produced a rusty trickle when he turned it, which he supposed counted as running water. The electricity worked sporadically, some outlets dead, others sparking ominously when he tested them. But it was the view from the back window that stopped him cold. The barn loomed like a grey monument to forgotten times, its roof sagging under the weight of missing shingles. What struck him wasn't its size, though it was massive, but the sheer impossibility of the task ahead. The real estate agent had mentioned it was full of items, but this looked like the final resting place of several estate sales. Jake grabbed his jacket and headed outside. The October air bit at his skin, carrying the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. Other families were probably gathering around dinner tables right now, discussing normal problems like homework and weekend plans. Instead, he was walking toward a barn that might collapse if he sneezed too hard. The massive doors hung askew on rusted hinges. He grabbed the handle and pulled, the wood groaning in protest. What he saw inside made him question whether he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Mountains of junk rose like small hills throughout the cavernous space. Old furniture buried under tarpaulins, towers of mouldering cardboard boxes, farm equipment from an era when horses did the work. Somewhere in the depths, he spotted the skeletal remains of what might have been a Model T Ford. The air was thick with dust and the sweet smell of decay. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice echoing in the vast space. A path of sorts wound between the piles, as if someone had regularly navigated this maze. Jake followed it, stepping carefully around rusted tools and boxes that sagged with moisture damage. The deeper he went, the older everything seemed to get. Modern garbage gave way to vintage items, then to genuine antiques. He was photographing a particularly impressive pile of junk to send to Sarah when his foot went through a rotted floorboard. The crash echoed through the barn as Jake tumbled forward, his phone flying from his hand. He landed hard on his shoulder, boxes tumbling around him in an avalanche of forgotten belongings. For a moment, he lay still, taking inventory of his body parts. Everything seemed to work, though his shoulder would definitely remind him of this moment tomorrow. As he struggled to his feet, brushing off decades of dirt, something caught his eye. The fallen boxes had revealed a corner of something metallic, gleaming dully in the filtered light. He pushed aside more debris, uncovering what appeared to be an old trunk. Unlike everything else in the barn, this trunk seemed to have been protected from the elements. The metal was tarnished, but solid, and when Jake ran his fingers along its surface, he could feel embossed lettering. He used his jacket sleeve to wipe away the grime, revealing words that made his blood run cold. Riverside Trust and Savings. Jake sat back on his heels, staring at the trunk. Riverside Trust had been his grandfather's bank, the one that had failed spectacularly in 1962, taking half the town's savings with it. His grandfather had died disgraced, and the family had spent years dealing with the aftermath. It was why Jake's father had been so obsessed with financial security, why the family name still carried whispers of shame in certain circles. But what was a bank trunk doing hidden in this barn? His hands shook as he examined the lock. It was old but substantial, designed to protect whatever lay inside. Jake had grown up hearing stories about the bank's collapse, about money that had simply vanished, about his grandfather's mysterious final days. The official story was that Samuel Morrison had been a fool who'd made bad investments and lost everything. Looking at this trunk, hidden beneath decades of carefully arranged junk, Jake began to wonder if the official story was wrong. The rusted padlock on the barn door crumbled in Jake's hands like ancient bread. He'd expected more resistance, but 40 years of Nebraska winters had done their work. The metal door groaned on its hinges as he pulled it open, releasing a musty wave of trapped air that spoke of decades undisturbed. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the weathered siding, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits above the chaos within. Mountains of debris filled the cavernous space: broken furniture, moldering cardboard boxes, farm equipment from another era, and items so buried under grime and neglect that their original purpose had become mysterious. Jake stepped inside, his boots crunching on scattered papers and debris. The smell hit him immediately: motor oil, rotting wood, and something else he couldn't identify. Something metallic and sharp that made his nose wrinkle. "Jesus," he muttered, surveying the overwhelming mess. Where would he even begin? A path had been worn through the center of the barn, as if someone had regularly navigated through the maze of junk. Jake followed it deeper into the shadows, noting how deliberately some items seemed to be placed. This wasn't random dumping. There was an organization to it, a method that suggested someone had been living with this chaos for years. Near the back wall, he discovered what looked like a makeshift office. A scarred wooden desk sat beneath a grimy window, its surface clear except for a thick layer of dust and a few scattered papers. Jake brushed away the grime and squinted at the documents underneath. Property deeds. His name was already on them, but underneath he could make out previous owners. The farm had changed hands several times since the 1980s, but before that there was a long stretch under one family name: Brennan. Jake frowned. His mother's maiden name had been Brennan. Sarah Brennan Morrison, born and raised in Chicago, or so she'd always told him, never mentioned Nebraska, never mentioned owning property or having family in farm country. He shuffled through more papers, finding utility bills dating back decades, all addressed to Thomas Brennan. A father? Uncle? The dates suggested someone had been living here, or at least maintaining the property, well into the 1990s. Behind the desk, partially hidden by a tarp-covered tractor, Jake spotted something that made his pulse quicken. A door, painted the same weathered red as the barn walls, but clearly leading to a separate room. The padlock on this door was newer, sturdier than the one that had secured the barn. Jake tested it, knowing it wouldn't give way as easily as the first. The metal was solid, uncompromising, but beside the door, where the wood had warped with age, he could see a gap just wide enough to slip his hand through. His fingers found a light switch on the other side, and when he flicked it, fluorescent bulbs hummed to life, casting harsh white light through the crack. What he could see made him step back in surprise. Clean walls, organized shelves. This room had been maintained while everything else fell apart. Jake circled the hidden room, looking for another way in. Behind stacks of moldering hay bales, he found a window, its glass surprisingly intact. Through it, he could see inside clearly for the first time. The room was a study, or maybe a workshop. Maps covered one wall, not just local areas, but what looked like military topographical surveys. A long table held neat rows of documents, photographs, and equipment he couldn't identify from this distance. Everything was covered with plastic sheeting, as if someone had carefully preserved it all before walking away. But it was the photographs pinned to a corkboard that made Jake's breath catch. Even through the dusty glass, he could recognize faces. His mother, but younger than he'd ever seen her, a man who shared Jake's jawline and dark hair, the same man from several other photos, wearing what looked like a military uniform. And in the center of it all, a newspaper clipping with a headline he could just barely make out. Local man missing after warehouse explosion. Jake pressed closer to the window, trying to read more, but the angle was wrong and the light inside the room threw shadows across the text. He could see a date, though, September 1982, 3 months before his birth. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone and called a locksmith. The voice that answered sounded bored until Jake offered to pay double for immediate service. While he waited, Jake wandered back through the barn, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just accumulated junk. It was a deliberate barrier. Someone had filled this space to hide what lay behind it, to make sure casual intruders would never find the locked room. The question that gnawed at him as he stood among the debris was simple but terrifying. What had his mother been hiding? And why had she never told him that everything he thought he knew about his family was a lie? The afternoon sun slanted through the barn's broken boards as Jake carefully lifted the heavy wooden crate from its hiding place. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it outside, the weight of both the box and his discovery pressing down on him. He set it on the farmhouse porch and stepped back, studying the brass nameplate that had stopped his world cold. A property of Dr. Marcus Wellington, confidential research materials. His grandfather's name, etched in metal that had somehow survived decades of neglect. But that was impossible. Marcus Wellington had been a simple farmer, a man who'd worked this very land with his hands, who'd raised cattle and corn, not someone who conducted research requiring locked boxes and hidden compartments. Jake's fingers traced the edges of the crate, searching for a way to open it. The wood was solid oak, built to last, with metal reinforcements at each corner. A heavy brass lock secured the front, its keyhole dark and unwelcoming. He'd need tools, or maybe he could find the key somewhere in the mess he'd been sorting through. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway made him look up. A silver sedan was approaching, moving slowly as if the driver was uncertain about the destination. Jake quickly draped a paint-stained tarp over the crate and stood as the car came to a stop. A woman emerged, probably in her 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a crisp white blouse and dark slacks that seemed far too clean for a place like this. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept across the property before settling on Jake. "You must be Jake Wellington," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. I worked with your grandfather many years ago." Jake shook her hand, confused. "Worked with him? I'm sorry, but I think you might have the wrong person. My grandfather was a farmer." Dr. Hartwell's expression shifted, a flicker of something, surprise, concern, crossing her features. "Jake, we need to talk. May I come inside? The house isn't really... It's not in great shape for visitors." "That's quite all right. What I have to say is more important than comfort." She glanced at the tarp-covered shape on the porch. "Have you found anything interesting while cleaning out the property?" The question sent a chill down Jake's spine. How could she possibly know about his discovery? Just the usual old farm stuff, nothing special. Dr. Hartwell studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Jake, your grandfather wasn't just a farmer. He was one of the most brilliant biochemists of his generation. His work here was significant. That's impossible. I would have known. My family would have told me. Your family was protecting you. Marcus made them promise to keep his past secret, for very good reasons. She moved closer, her voice dropping. What he was working on, what he discovered, there were people who would have done anything to get their hands on it. When he retired from active research, he disappeared completely, became the simple farmer you knew. But he never stopped his work entirely. Jake felt the ground shifting beneath him. Everything he thought he knew, crumbling. What kind of work? Medical research, breakthrough research, the kind that could change the world or destroy it, depending on who controls it. Her eyes flicked to the covered crate again. Those people I mentioned? They never stopped looking for him, and now that he's gone, they'll be looking for whatever he left behind. How do you know all this? And why should I trust you? Dr. Hartwell reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. It showed a younger version of herself standing next to a man Jake recognized as his grandfather, but not the grandfather he'd known. This man wore a white lab coat and safety goggles, standing in front of complex equipment in what was obviously a high-tech laboratory. We were research partners for 15 years before he disappeared. I've been keeping track of this property ever since, waiting for the day someone would inherit it and potentially find what he left behind. She tucked the photograph away. I know this is overwhelming, Jake, but you're in danger. There are already people who know the property has been sold. They'll be coming. What people? What are you talking about? Corporate interests, government agencies, groups that operate in the shadows. Your grandfather's final research could be worth billions, or it could be a weapon that no one should possess. I don't know which, because he kept those final discoveries to himself. Jake's mind raced. The locked crate, the hidden compartment, the careful way everything had been concealed. His grandfather had been preparing for something or hiding from something. What do you want from me? He asked. I want to help you find whatever he left behind before they do, and then I want to make sure it ends up in the right hands. Dr. Hartwell's expression grew grave. Because if it doesn't, your grandfather's greatest achievement could become humanity's greatest nightmare. The metal briefcase sat on Jake's kitchen table like an accusation, its contents spread across the scarred wood surface in neat piles. 3 days had passed since he'd pried it open, and he still couldn't make sense of what he was looking at. Birth certificates, property deeds, bank statements, all bearing names he didn't recognize, yet somehow connected to addresses he knew by heart. Sarah arrived as promised, her investigative instincts kicking in the moment she saw the documents. She picked up a faded photograph of a man who looked remarkably like Jake's father, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and Jake's own stubborn jawline. This woman, Sarah said, studying the photo. She's listed as Margaret Whitmore on this birth certificate, but look at this. She held up a marriage license. 6 months later, she becomes Margaret Chen. Your grandmother's maiden name was Chen, wasn't it? Jake nodded, his mouth dry. But her first name was Rose. Everyone called her Rose. People change their names for all sorts of reasons. Sarah's voice was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. Especially when they're running from something. The documentation painted a picture that made Jake's head spin. Property transfers dating back to the 1940s, moving assets from Margaret Whitmore to Margaret Chen to a trust fund that seemed to disappear into legal paperwork so complex it would take a team of lawyers to untangle. But the most disturbing discovery was a newspaper clipping from 1947, yellowed and fragile, with a headline that made Jake's blood run cold: local family missing after factory fire, foul play suspected. The Whitmores owned half this county back then, Sarah said, having spent the morning at the county clerk's office. Factories, farmland, even part of what's now the downtown district. Then, suddenly, nothing. All their holdings transferred or sold within a 6-month period, and the family just vanished. Jake stared at a bank statement showing a deposit of $847,000 in 1947, a fortune by any standard, but especially then. You think my grandmother was Margaret Whitmore? That she stole this money? Or saved it? Sarah countered. Look at the dates. The transfers happened before the newspaper report. Maybe she knew something was coming. A knock at the door interrupted their theorizing. Through the window, Jake saw a black sedan parked in his driveway and a man in an expensive suit waiting on his porch. Something about the visitor's posture, too straight, too alert, set off alarm bells. Mr. Morrison? The man's smile was practiced, professional. I'm David Kellerman from Kellerman and Associates. I believe you've found something that belongs to my client. Jake kept the door mostly closed, his body blocking the entrance. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong house. The briefcase, Mr. Morrison, along with its contents. My client is prepared to make a very generous offer for its return. Kellerman's eyes were cold despite his warm tone. No questions asked, of course. I don't know what you're talking about. Kellerman's smile faltered slightly. Perhaps I should be more direct. The items you found were stolen property. My client has been tracking them for decades. We can resolve this quietly, or we can involve the authorities. I suspect you'd prefer the former. Jake felt Sarah's presence behind him, solid and reassuring. Who's your client? That's confidential, I'm afraid. But I can tell you they have a legitimate claim to anything found on that property. The previous owner had no right to hide stolen goods on land that wasn't rightfully his. The previous owner died broke, Jake said. If someone had a claim to anything on that property, they would have made it during the estate sale. Kellerman reached into his jacket, causing Jake to tense, but he only pulled out a business card. My client prefers to handle these matters discreetly. The offer stands until tomorrow at noon. After that, we'll be forced to pursue other options. After the sedan disappeared down the road, Jake and Sarah sat in silence, the weight of the encounter settling over them like a storm cloud. He knew exactly what we found, Sarah said finally, which means someone's been watching you, or they've been watching that property for a very long time. Jake picked up the photograph of the woman who might have been his grandmother, studying her face for any hint of the secrets she'd carried. What if she did steal it? What if everything I thought I knew about my family is a lie? Then we figure out the truth, Sarah said firmly. But Jake, we need to be careful. If someone's been looking for this briefcase for 70 years, they're not going to give up easily, and they might not be as polite as Mr. Kellerman next time. Jake looked out the window toward the barn, where this had all started, its weathered walls hiding who knew what other secrets. Tomorrow at noon suddenly felt both too soon and not soon enough. Jake's hands trembled as he held the photograph, studying every detail of his grandfather's face beside the man he now knew was Viktor Kozlov. The barn felt smaller somehow, the weight of decades-old secrets pressing down from the rafters above. He set the photo aside and reached for the leather journal beneath it, its pages yellowed and brittle. The first entry was dated March 15, 1953, written in his grandfather's careful script. As Jake read, the familiar handwriting seemed to whisper from beyond the grave, revealing a story that turned everything he thought he knew upside down. Victor arrived today. He's thinner than I expected, haunted. The things he's seen, I can barely imagine. He says the government thinks he's dead, killed in the lab explosion in Nevada. Better that way, he tells me. Better for everyone. Jake's pulse quickened. A government lab explosion? He flipped through more pages, finding scattered entries that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. H. showed me the prototype today. Says it's worth millions to the right buyer, billions to the wrong one. I told him I don't want to know the details. Some knowledge is too dangerous to carry. If federal agents came by again asking about unusual activity in the area. I told them nothing, but they're getting suspicious. V says we need to be more careful. The barn modifications are almost complete. Jake looked up from the journal, scanning the barn with new eyes. Modifications? The structure looked ordinary enough, but now he noticed subtle irregularities, slightly newer boards in certain sections, metal reinforcements that seemed unnecessary for storing farm equipment. He stood and walked to the east wall, running his hands along the weathered planks. About halfway down, his fingers caught on something unusual. A small section of board moved slightly under pressure. Jake pushed harder, and a hidden panel swung inward, revealing a narrow space behind the wall. His heart hammering, he grabbed his flashlight and squeezed through the opening. The hidden room was larger than he'd expected, maybe 10 feet square, with concrete walls and a reinforced ceiling. But it was what sat in the center of the room that made him step back in shock. A metal cylinder, roughly the size of a trash can, sat on a purpose-built stand. Warning labels in multiple languages covered its surface, though most were too faded to read clearly. The few he could make out sent ice through his veins: radioactive, danger, authorized personnel only. Jake backed toward the opening, but something else caught his attention. Documents were scattered on a makeshift desk against the far wall. He forced himself to move closer, keeping as much distance as possible from the cylinder. The papers told the rest of the story his grandfather's journal had begun. Viktor Kozlov hadn't just been a scientist. He'd been part of a classified weapons program. When he'd grown uncomfortable with the project's direction, he'd stolen a prototype and staged his own death. Jake's grandfather had helped him hide it, believing they were keeping dangerous technology out of the wrong hands. But the final document made Jake's blood run cold. It was a letter dated just weeks before his grandfather's death, addressed to my dear grandson, Jacob. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found what we've kept hidden all these years. I pray you never had to discover this burden, but if you have, then you must make the choice Victor and I couldn't. The prototype has been stable for decades, but it won't remain so forever. The containment will eventually fail. Eye contact. Dr. Sarah Chen at the Department of Energy. She's one of the few people who can safely handle what's in that room. Tell her Magpie sends his regards. She'll understand. Whatever you do, don't try to move it yourself, and don't let anyone else know what you found until you're certain they can be trusted. I'm sorry, Jake. We thought we were doing the right thing, but we may have only delayed an inevitable reckoning. The choice is yours, now, Datia. Jake's hands shook as he lowered the letter. His grandfather had died knowing this secret, carrying the weight of it alone, and now that burden fell to him. He carefully photographed the documents with his phone, then backed out of the hidden room, sealing the panel behind him. The barn felt different now, not just a repository of junk, but a tomb containing something that could, apparently, kill him and anyone else who came too close. As he stood there processing everything he'd learned, he heard the distant sound of a car engine. Jake quickly stuffed the journal and photograph back into the metal box, his mind racing. Who could he trust? The letter mentioned Dr. Chen, but contacting a government scientist would mean admitting he'd been harboring classified materials. And what if someone else already knew about the prototype? What if that's why the property had been so cheap, why no one else had bid on it? The engine sound grew closer. Jake grabbed the metal box and moved toward the barn door, peering through a gap in the boards. A black sedan was turning into his driveway, and something about the way it moved, slow, purposeful, told him this wasn't a friendly visit. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmhouse kitchen as Jake spread the contents of the metal box across the scarred wooden table. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the photographs, documents, and that damning letter from his grandfather. Sarah sat across from him, her coffee growing cold as she studied each piece of evidence with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to unraveling complex puzzles. "This changes everything," she murmured, holding up a photograph of 3 men standing beside what was unmistakably the barn outside. The youngest looked exactly like Jake's grandfather, but 30 years younger. "If these documents are authentic, your family didn't just own this property. They were part of something much bigger." Jake picked up the letter again, reading his grandfather's familiar handwriting for the 10th time. The words seemed to burn into his retinas. "The truth about what we did in 1962 must never come to light. The families involved have too much to lose. Keep this buried, for all our sakes." 3 families, Jake said, pointing to the names scrawled at the bottom of a yellowed contract. "Morrison, Blackwood, and Chen. I recognize Morrison, that's the mayor's family. They've run this town for generations." Sarah nodded grimly. "And Chen Construction just happens to be the company that's been pushing hardest to buy your land." She pulled out her phone and began typing. "The timing isn't coincidental, Jake. Someone knows you found something." The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway made them both freeze. Through the kitchen window, Jake watched a black sedan pull up beside his truck. 2 men in dark suits emerged, moving with the confident stride of people accustomed to getting their way. "Hide everything," Jake whispered urgently, but Sarah was already 1 step ahead, sweeping the documents into a canvas bag she'd brought from her car. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Jake answered the door to find 2 men who looked like they'd stepped out of a federal agency handbook, clean-shaven, expressionless, and radiating authority. "Mr. Sullivan?" The taller one flashed a badge too quickly for Jake to read the details. "Agent Phillips, FBI. This is Agent Chen. We need to speak with you about some items that may have been discovered on this property." Jake's blood ran cold at the name Chen, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "May we come in?" Agent Chen asked, though he was already stepping forward. His slight accent carried the weight of someone who expected compliance. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, her reporter's instincts clearly on high alert. "Gentlemen, I'm Sarah Martinez with the Herald. Might I ask what brings federal agents to a small farming community?" Agent Phillips's eyes narrowed. "This is official business, ma'am. We'll need you to leave." "Actually," Sarah replied smoothly, "Mr. Sullivan is currently the subject of a human interest story I'm writing. Unless you're arresting him, I believe I have every right to be here." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Jake could practically feel the weight of the hidden documents like a physical presence. Agent Chen walked slowly around the small living room, his eyes taking in every detail. "Mr. Sullivan, we have reason to believe that certain historical items may have been unearthed during your recent renovations. Items that could be considered matters of national security." "National security?" Jake laughed, hoping it sounded genuine. "You're talking about a bankrupt farm in the middle of nowhere. The most exciting thing I've found is a rusty tractor that hasn't run since the Clinton administration." Agent Phillips stepped closer. "Your grandfather, Thomas Sullivan, was involved in certain government contracts during the Cold War. Some materials from that era have gone missing from official records. We're simply trying to account for everything." Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and her expression changed subtly. "Interesting," she said, looking up at Agent Chen. "I just received a very curious email about construction permits filed for this exact property, permits dated 3 weeks ago, before Mr. Sullivan even found anything of note." The silence that followed was deafening. Agent Chen's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something much more dangerous underneath. "I think," Jake said carefully, "that I'd like to contact my lawyer before this conversation goes any further." Agent Phillips reached into his jacket, and Jake's muscles tensed, but the man only produced a business card. "Mr. Sullivan, there are people in this town who have worked very hard to keep certain secrets buried. For everyone's sake, including yours, it would be wise to let sleeping dogs lie." As the agents left, Jake watched their sedan disappear down the gravel road. The morning that had started with promise now felt heavy with menace. "They're not FBI," Sarah said quietly, still staring at her phone screen. "How do you know?" She turned the phone toward him, showing an email from her editor. "Because the real FBI just issued a statement that they have no active investigations in this county." The phone rang at 3 in the morning, jolting Jake from a restless sleep. He fumbled for it in the darkness, his heart already racing with the kind of dread that only came with late-night calls. "Jake, it's Sheriff Morrison. You need to get down here, now." 20 minutes later, Jake stood in the barn doorway, watching crime scene techs photograph the empty space where the crates had been. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor, making the barn feel like a morgue. "They knew exactly what they were looking for," Morrison said, joining him at the threshold. "No forced entry, nothing else disturbed. Professional job." Jake's mind raced. Only 3 people knew about the discovery: himself, Morrison, and Sarah Chen. Unless someone had been watching, listening, waiting for the right moment. "The timing's too perfect," Jake muttered. "Right after we found the connection to the Hartwell account." Morrison nodded grimly. "That's what worries me. This isn't random theft, Jake. Someone's been playing a long game, and you just became a liability." A black sedan pulled into the driveway, its headlights sweeping across the barn. Jake tensed as 2 figures emerged, a woman in a dark suit and an older man with silver hair who moved with quiet authority. "Federal agents," Morrison explained under his breath. "Called them myself after I saw the scene." The woman approached first, flashing credentials. "Agent Rodriguez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. This is Agent Campbell. We understand you've uncovered some historical documents related to the Hartwell investigation." Jake exchanged glances with Morrison. "The Hartwell investigation?" Campbell stepped forward, his weathered face serious. "The Hartwell steel embezzlement case from 1987. We've been tracking the missing funds for decades. Your grandfather, Frank Russo, was our primary witness before he disappeared." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. "Disappeared? He died in a car accident." "That's what everyone was told," Rodriguez said gently. "The truth is more complicated. Your grandfather was in witness protection after he came forward with evidence about the theft. Someone leaked his location." Jake felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Everything he'd believed about his family, his grandfather's death, his father's bitterness, all of it built on lies. "The documents you found," Campbell continued, "they're the missing piece. Proof of where the money went, who was involved at the highest levels. Your grandfather died protecting that evidence. And now someone has it," Jake said hollowly. "Not necessarily." Rodriguez pulled out a tablet, showing him surveillance footage from a traffic camera. "We've been monitoring known associates of the original conspirators. This van was spotted leaving your property around midnight." Jake studied the grainy image. The license plate was partially obscured, but something about the vehicle seemed familiar. "I need to call Sarah," he said suddenly. "Dr. Chen, the historian who was helping me authenticate the documents." Morrison handed him his phone. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Jake tried her office number with the same result. "She's not answering," he said, anxiety creeping into his voice. Campbell was already on his radio, dispatching units to Sarah's address. The next hour crawled by in agonizing uncertainty until Rodriguez's phone buzzed. "She's safe," she announced. "Found her at the university library, working late, but her office was ransacked tonight." Jake sank onto a hay bale, overwhelmed. "They're after everyone who knows about this." "Which is why we need to move fast," Campbell said. The people behind this have waited 37 years to bury this secret. They won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens that. But the documents are gone. What can we do now? Rodriguez smiled for the first time that night. Your Dr. Chen is thorough. She photographed everything before leaving your property yesterday. Digital copies uploaded to a secure server. A spark of hope ignited in Jake's chest. So we still have evidence. We have everything, Campbell confirmed. Names, account numbers, routing information for offshore banks. Your grandfather didn't just document the theft, he tracked where every stolen dollar went. Jake thought about his father, bitter and withdrawn after his own father's supposed death. About the farm falling into disrepair, the family struggling financially while millions in stolen money sat hidden in their barn. There's something else, Morrison said quietly. The break-in tonight, they left something behind. He held up an evidence bag containing a single photograph. Jake's grandfather shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside the Hartwell Steel offices. The man in the suit, Campbell said, is currently a sitting U.S. senator. He was Hartwell's vice president of finance in 1987. Jake stared at the photograph, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't just about old embezzlement charges. This was about protecting a political career built on stolen money and murder. They'll come for you next, Rodriguez warned. Are you prepared for that? Jake looked around the barn where his grandfather had risked everything to preserve the truth, where 3 generations of his family had unknowingly guarded justice itself. Let them come, he said quietly. It's time to finish what my grandfather started. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Jake stood before the open barn doors, the wooden crate at his feet. Inside lay the truth about his grandfather's wartime activities, documents that painted Thomas Chen as both hero and criminal, depending on which side of history you occupied. The phone in his pocket buzzed insistently. His lawyer, probably. The bankruptcy hearing was in 3 hours. You going to answer that? Sarah asked, emerging from the farmhouse with 2 cups of coffee. Jake silenced the phone. Later. He accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the steam. I keep thinking about what Mr. Kowalski said, about how sometimes the right thing looks wrong from the outside. Sarah nodded toward the crate. And sometimes family legacies are more complicated than we want them to be. The documents told a story Jake was still piecing together. His grandfather hadn't been a simple farmer. During the war, he'd operated a complex network that smuggled refugees and resistance fighters across enemy lines. The jewelry, the gold, the cash, payment for safe passage, fees for forged documents, bribes for corrupt officials. Some of it had belonged to people who never made it to safety. The irony is almost funny, Jake said, settling beside Sarah on the barn's threshold. I bought this place because I was broke. Now I'm sitting on a fortune, and I still don't know if I can keep it. The ethical weight of the discovery pressed down on him. How many families might have rightful claims to these valuables? How many descendants were still searching for lost heirlooms? Yet, without this windfall, he'd lose everything. The farm, his chance at a fresh start, possibly his relationship with Sarah. Have you decided what you're going to tell the court? Sarah asked. Before Jake could answer, gravel crunched in the driveway. A black sedan approached, followed by 2 police cars. Jake's stomach dropped as he recognized Detective Morrison emerging from the lead vehicle. Behind him came a man in an expensive suit. Federal, Jake guessed from his bearing. Mr. Chen? Detective Morrison called out. We need to talk. Jake stood slowly, Sarah rising beside him. About what? The federal agent stepped forward. Agent Williams, Department of Justice. We understand you've made some discoveries related to wartime activities. We'd like to discuss the implications. How did you... Jake began. Mr. Kowalski contacted us yesterday, Agent Williams explained. He felt the situation required federal oversight. May we see what you've found?" Jake's mind raced. He gestured toward the crate, watching as Agent Williams examined the contents with practiced efficiency. The man's expression remained neutral as he sifted through documents, photographs, and valuables. "This appears to be part of a larger network we've been researching for decades," Williams said finally. "Your grandfather was known to us, Mr. Chen. He was actually working with Allied intelligence, though that wasn't widely documented for security reasons." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He was working with the Allies? Officially, yes, though the situation was complex. Some of his activities crossed legal boundaries, even in wartime. The items here represent a significant ethical and legal challenge. Detective Morrison stepped closer. "The question is, what happens now?" Agent Williams closed the crate carefully. "The Department of Justice has been working with international organizations to return looted artwork and valuables to rightful owners or their descendants. This collection will need to be evaluated, catalogued, and researched. It's a lengthy process." "What does that mean for me?" Jake asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "In the short term, these items will need to be held in federal custody while we conduct our investigation. However," Williams paused, consulting a folder, "there may be compensation available through the recovery program. Not immediately, but eventually." Sarah reached for Jake's hand. "How long is eventually?" "Months, possibly years." Jake felt the weight of bankruptcy crushing down on him again. The hearing was in less than 3 hours, and his miraculous salvation was about to disappear into federal custody. He thought about his grandfather, about the impossible choices war had forced on him, about the refugees who trusted him with their lives and their treasures. "There's something else," Agent Williams continued. "We'd like to offer you a position as a consultant on this case. Your family connection and knowledge of the property could be valuable. It comes with a retainer fee." "How much?" Williams named a figure that wouldn't solve all of Jake's problems, but would buy him time. Enough to negotiate with creditors, enough to keep the farm while the federal investigation proceeded. Jake looked around the farmyard, at the house his grandfather had built, at the barn where family secrets had waited decades to be discovered. Sarah squeezed his hand encouragingly. "I accept," he said finally, "but I want to be involved in returning everything to the rightful families. My grandfather risked his life to help people. The least I can do is help finish what he started." Agent Williams smiled for the first time. "I think he'd be proud of that decision, Mr. Chen." As federal agents began carefully cataloging the treasure, Jake realized he'd found something more valuable than gold or jewels. He'd found his place in his family's complicated but ultimately honorable legacy.